Hello and welcome. My name is Mariam Hamadani. I'm the Associate Director of CCSRE, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Thank you for coming tonight to our third and final Faculty Research Fellows Chautauqua of the Year. Thank you so much for being a part of and supporting our new program. We're here tonight to celebrate the work of our fellows, Minian and Cherri Moraga, and also to enjoy a stimulating intellectual conversation over dinner among friends. Let me tell you a little bit about what the Chautauquas are supposed to be. They're really meant to be informal and discussion-based, so please continue to say hi to your neighbors. Feel free to get up and get more food. During the event, get another glass of wine, and also share your reactions and thoughts during the discussion portion of our conversation. So we're really looking forward to engaging together as a community tonight. Our moderator for tonight's Chautauqua is the director of CCSRE, Professor Jose David Saldivar. Professor Saldivar is Professor of Comparative Literature and Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. He specializes in late post-contemporary culture, especially the minoritized literatures of the United States, Latin America, and the Trans-American Hemisphere, and also of border narrative and poetics from the 16th century to the present. His most recent book is Transamericanity, Subaltern Modernities, Global Coloniality, and the Cultures of Greater Mexico. So as you can see, he's really an excellent fit to be our moderator tonight for our two speakers and fellows. Before I turn it over to Professor Saldivar, he'll make some opening remarks and also introduce our fellows. I'd like to give a special thank you to Heidi Lopez, Chris Queen, and Tracy Holmes for their vital support of this program and for tonight's event. Thank you so much for your hard work this year. So now I'll turn it over to Professor Saldivar.
Good evening, everyone. And I'll let you continue eating. Rather than kind of open up with a statement about what I see these two wonderful works have in common, I thought I would just go straight to the introducing our speakers. I'll introduce Ana first, and then Cherri second, and they'll each have 20 minutes to give us a presentation. And then I thought I would begin to open up the discussion on the many kinds of articulations and linkages and conjunctures that I see between a historian of our present moment in the 21st century about migrants and a scribe of consciousness, the scribe. So I'm interested in what is that relationship between the historian and the scribe of the 21st century, and they both seem to be articulating the powerful nature of history and historia, storytelling, cuentos, culture as a kind of ordinary phenomenon, race as being ordinary, and the things that are part of it. So tremendously enjoyed reading these two great books, and we're really lucky to have Cherri and Ana before us. So first I'll introduce Professor Minian. Ana Raquel Minian is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and she just joined us this year, so it's wonderful to have her on board. Ana received her BA, or Bachelor of Arts, at the University of Chicago, and her PhD at Yale. Her PhD dissertation, I know she's modest about that, won the 2012 Henry Gabriel Prize from the American Studies Association for the best dissertation of the year in the field of American Studies. No small feat, so congratulations on a wonderful work that we have. So from reading and gleaning this version of her dissertation, her book manuscript, one can see why the American Studies Association honored Ana with this great award. Her book project, entitled Undocumented Lives, A History of Mexico-U.S. Migration from 1965 to 1986, and I was really interested in just the periodization. Why begin with the Bracero program and go to IRCA, the Immigration and Reform and Control Act? What a wonderful bookends to talk about your project. To explore the late 20th century history of Mexican undocumented migration to the United States. the growth of migrant communities, and Mexico's and the United States' efforts to regulate the border, La Frontera. Now, among all the things that I really enjoyed in reading this book and learned, I really enjoyed how Ana examines the relationship between ethnic Mexican expressive and political cultures and the practices that sustain migrant social movements. As Ana so beautifully put it, and I'm summarizing a little bit of it, so she'll have to excuse me, she says, across national borders, migrants fall in love. They raise families. They send remittances back home. And migrant men control their wives to ensure that they will not become unfaithful. And I thought that was a wonderful way of almost ending this idea of the ordinariness of migrant culture. They are ordinary like the rest of us, but under very, as Mark said, not under conditions of our own making, of production, perhaps. Ana's manuscript uses a capacious archive with over 200 oral history interviews, testimonios, government archives, migrant love letters, poetry, corridos by Los Tigres del Norte, border ballads, privately held organizational records and personal collections, pamphlets, unpublished ephemera, and newspaper collections in Washington, D.C., Chicago, the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Michoacan, Zacatecas, and Mexico City. So a real kind of tour de force of archive fever. So without further ado, let's welcome Ana to our Chautauqua.
Wow, thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction and for such a nice and kind words. I really appreciate them. I really want to thank CCSRE for inviting me to be a fellow this year, and also for supporting me throughout this first year at Stanford. It has been a much easier first year as a faculty member here, thanks to their support. I also want to thank all of you for reading perhaps part of the manuscript, for being here today, and for all your comments and follow-up questions. Unlike other faculty fellows, what I have given you is not a book, but a book manuscript. I'm still working on it. So any feedback that you provide me will be very, very appreciated. I also want to say what an honor it is to be here today presenting with Cherri Moraga. Her words and her work have influenced me as both a scholar and as a person since I was 18 and reading Loving and the Warriors. So yeah, it's really, really an honor. And in terms of putting our work together, I hope that my manuscript reflects what she has taught us about sexuality, about race, about ethnicity, and about questioning the nation state. So thank you very much. So let me tell you a little bit more about my project. In my book manuscript, I explore the history of Mexican undocumented migration from 1965 to 1986. And so why these two bookends, as you were saying? In 1965, the Bracero program ends. People stopped coming as braceros in 1965. Braceros were contract workers who could come legally to the country from Mexico, stay here for short periods of time, generally 9 months, and then return to Mexico. In 1965, they no longer can come as contract workers, so they start coming in greater and greater numbers without papers. We can see the rise of undocumented migration from 1970 to 1986 through INS apprehensions, which of course are not perfect, but they do tell us something. In 1970, 500,000 undocumented workers were apprehended. In 1986, 1.5 million. I end the project in 1986 with the passage of IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And the reason I ended with this act is because it really changes how migration looks. During the period I study, migration starts happening in greater and greater numbers with people coming without papers, as I said, and it also happens in a circular fashion. So people come from Mexico, stay in the United States for a short period of time, a couple of months, a couple of years, return to Mexico, and then start the process all over again, so they come back. So during this period from 1965 to 1986, what we really see is the rise of undocumented circular migration. After 1986, after the passage of RICSRE, there is an increasing militarization of the border, so people stopped coming in a circular fashion. Instead, they come, but they stay in the United States, right? They come out of economic need, but they don't risk going back to Mexico. So that's why I pretty much picked this time period. I also picked this time period because I think that it is one of the most significant periods in seeing the government policies that exist right now. I argue that during the mid-1970s, both the US and the Mexican governments turned against undocumented migrants. They started seeing Mexican working class people as a hindrance to the economic development of their nation. So let me go a little bit more into this. From 1821, with Mexican independence, to the mid-1970s, the Mexican government viewed a large population as indispensable to economic growth. They thought that more bodies in Mexico meant that the country could modernize more quickly, that economic development could happen more quickly. So they really wanted people. They wanted to populate the nation. In terms of migration, what this meant is that they wanted to discourage people from going to the United States and staying there for long periods of time. The Mexican government, up until the mid-1970s, do encourage some people, a limited number of them, to come to the United States with the idea that in the US workers can modernize. But they only want them to come for short periods and then return to Mexico and work in Mexico. In the mid-1970s, this position changes radically. And this change happens because of changes in Mexico's economy. In the mid-1970s, Mexico sees a huge economic recession. The balance of payment in the mid-1970s runs a huge deficit. Consumer prices double. Before leaving office in 1976, President Cherríe is forced to devalue the peso, ask for assistance from the IMF, and accept its austerity package. The years between 1970 and 1982 are seen as being so bad for the Mexican economy that Mexicans still refer to them as the tragic dozen. So, in this context of rising unemployment, suddenly the government decides that it doesn't really want more bodies. It actually wants to reduce the number of people residing in Mexico. So suddenly, population growth is no longer seen as positive, but as negative. And they decide to go about reducing the number of people residing in Mexico in 3 different ways. First, they start to encourage women to have fewer and fewer children. They do this through campaigns such as ones with the slogan, La familia pequeña vive mejor. The small family lives better. But when women are unwilling to comply, or for women who are unwilling to comply, for working class, often indigenous women who are unwilling to comply, government officials often forcibly sterilize them. So doctors at clinics run by governments forcibly sterilize them. In some communities, it is documented that up to 90% of indigenous women were sterilized. And of course, this is a huge number, and it only happened in certain communities. But it's a way in which the government is trying to reduce the number of people. A second way in which the government tries to reduce the number of people residing in Mexico is by increasingly militarizing the border between Mexico and Guatemala so that less Guatemaltecos come into Mexico. And in terms of emigration, they now start to push to encourage Mexicans to go to the United States, and no longer to return after short periods of time, but to remain in the United States for longer and longer periods of time. Now, if you guys think about it, what this means is that the Mexican government is pushing its own citizens to a country that considers them illegal. Let me give you a couple of examples that demonstrate this broad change in policy from ones that discouraged long-term immigration to one that encouraged it. First, up until the mid-1970s, the Mexican government forcibly transported deportees into the interior of Mexico. So when INS officials apprehended undocumented workers in the United States, INS officials would take them to certain points in the border with Mexico and hand them off to oficiales, officials, from the Departamento de Migración. Now, these officials from the Departamento de Migración knew that if they released workers at the border, these deportees at the border, they would simply cross the border again into the United States the next day. So instead, up until the mid-1970s, oficiales from the Departamento de Migración would take them deeper into Mexico so that they couldn't cross back into the US so easily. They would take them to places like Guanajuato and Michoacán. In the mid-1970s, when the Mexican government changes its policies, they stop forcibly transporting workers away from the border region. Of course, US officials are really angry, and they send letters to the Mexican government saying, like, no, you must continue this practice. Undocumented workers are coming. But Mexico officially stops agreeing to take deportees into the interior of Mexico. Another way in which we can see this broad change in policy, just to give you a couple of examples, is in its rhetoric around human rights. Up until the mid-1970s, Mexican officials explicitly tell Mexican citizens that if they go to the United States without papers, neither Mexican government officials nor US officials will defend their rights. They tell them that if they go to the United States without papers, they will officially lose their right to protection. In the mid-1970s, this rhetoric changes radically. Mexico starts putting in every consulate offices for the protection of undocumented workers. They start distributing a pamphlet within Mexico, telling people that if they migrate, whether they do so legally or without papers, they will still defend their rights in the consulate. Of course, this is a rhetoric that encourages people to go to the United States. In fact, Mexico was really open about this change in policy. From the mid-1970s onwards, Mexican officials continually meet US officials and tell them that Mexico can no longer absorb such a huge population and that they need workers to go to the United States in greater and greater numbers. In 1979, for example, Jorge Castañeda, who was then the Secretary of Foreign Affairs in Mexico, tells US officials that he thought that Mexico and the United States had a special relationship. But that he's really not seeing this special relationship because Mexicans are not allowed to go to the United States with more opportunity than people from other countries. And so he tells the officials, well, given that Mexico does not have this special relationship with the United States, Mexico might turn to look for aid elsewhere. And he says, to Europe, Japan, the socialist countries. Of course, this is a not too veiled threat during the Cold War that if the United States does not accept more undocumented workers, then Mexico might turn for aid to communist countries. Now, during this period, the United States is also going through a recession. The 1970s is a huge period of inflation in the United States and of growing unemployment. Immigrants during periods of recession generally get blamed. It's no different in the 1970s. They are blamed for the country's welfare mess, for draining the welfare coffers, for taking service sector jobs. And basically, they start to be seen as unwelcome visitors. In response to this new rhetoric towards undocumented migration, US officials start to conduct more and more raids within the United States in Latino neighborhoods, to more heavily militarize the border, and to deport an overall greater number of immigrants. So what we see is that during this period, the policies of the United States and of Mexico, when we study them together in conjunction, we see that there is a border that is drawn, not just through Mexico and the United States, but also around Mexico and the United States. Both of these countries are pushing working class citizens out of their respective national territory. In this new border, Mexicans don't have the right to belong according to nation states. Now, the second part of my project is to document how, in this context in which both nation states are asserting that working class Mexicans don't have a right to belong, Mexican citizens themselves push forward their own visions of belonging. So to document this, as Jose David was saying, I conducted about 200 oral history interviews on both sides of the border. And I tried to investigate how people understood where they belong. So one of the things that I found most interesting is how ideas about belonging influenced patterns of migration. So of course, the Mexican government is pushing undocumented workers to leave, Mexican working class, indigenous often, workers to leave Mexico and to go to the United States. But not everyone migrates in the same amount, in the same quantity. So women, for example, migrate much less than men do. And what many of you might find surprising is that also gay men migrate in much lower numbers than their heterosexual counterparts. Now, I think that a lot of people find this surprising, and I don't know if you guys did, but a lot of people who I talk to find this surprising because of this idea, right, about what Mexico represents and what Mexico is. So they view small-town Mexican communities as extremely religious. Of course, gay men would want to migrate, if anything more than their heterosexual counterparts, to liberal United States, right? But ideas about belonging in Mexico and among Mexicans are actually different. In fact, gay men, queer men, migrate in much lower numbers than their heterosexual counterparts. In the town of Nochistlán, Zacatecas, for example, I found out that 65% of all men of reproductive age migrated, while only 15, so 65 versus 15 of queer men migrated during the same period. Of course, this is about people's own visions of belonging, of who should migrate, of who should stay in Mexico. So just to give you a couple of reasons that queer men told me that they didn't migrate. First, they all told me that they identified as half women, and women didn't migrate, so they wouldn't either. And I can go into more detail about this, because right now I only have 20 minutes, but in the Q&A session. Another reason they told me was that not only were they seen as half women, but they were seen as better than women. So queer men could take jobs that were traditionally taken on by women, such as florist or hairdresser. But they would be paid more, and they would get more customers, because people would prefer and see gay men as better than women. Another reason that they often told me why they didn't migrate is because they lacked the family networks needed to migrate. So a lot of people, most migrants, come to the United States with the use of family networks, right? So people cross the border without papers, but often are helped by people who already reside people who already reside here. People who already reside here often send money to pay for people's coyotes and then allow migrants to stay in their house for short periods of time while they find jobs and housing. Queer men said that they feared that they lacked this support. As one gay man told me, my uncle wouldn't put me up in his house. Who knows what I would do to his children? So these ideologies about belonging, about who belongs where, influenced migration just as much as official government policies. Another ways in which visions of belonging and people's own visions of belonging influenced life in Mexico and the United States was not just by influencing the patterns of migration, but also by influencing activism. So during the 1970s, migrants in Los Angeles started hometown associations, which were migrant clubs that sent money back to Mexico to build up the infrastructure. So not as remittances, which is what we generally think of, so not from family member to family member, but from community to community. So they would create all these events to fundraise money, dances, dinners, meetings. They would fundraise a lot of money, send it back to Mexico, and help build up Mexican towns. A lot of towns in Mexico, even nowadays, have potable water, electricity, schools, thanks to the money that these hometown associations sent. In other words, these hometown associations were building Mexican infrastructure. They were telling people, they were telling Mexicans that they had a right to belong in Mexico, and they were telling themselves through their actions that one day they would return and have a hometown with basic and needed infrastructure, with potable water, electricity. They were also creating a site in which they would belong and could belong in the United States. In a nation in which they felt alienated, discriminated, in which raids were happening in their neighborhoods, these parties, these dances would create a community in which migrants could feel that they belonged, not just in Mexico, but also in the United States. I can talk more about this in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
Feel free to stretch and get some more food and more wine. That's what I'll have to do after this. Now, wasn't that an awesome presentation by Ana, and her great work? And as I said, I learned so much about not just how migrants have created their own sense of belonging in this country, but how Mexican government itself was complicit in, pushing out this surplus population, as you put it in your book. And I think that's what, at least from my non-historian hat, see as one of the most original parts of Ana's research is, and of course she's also alluded to the great line by Porfirio Diaz, so far from God, so close to the United States, in the sense of belonging. Now, again, it's a real honor for me to introduce, and a bit daunting to try to introduce a lifelong friend that I've known from 1984. Maybe I wish I had read Loving the Warriors when I was 18. That would have been awesome. I didn't. No, I tell you, because I didn't read it until I was in my 30s like you. We're contemporaries. I not only read it, but I wrote about it in my first book. Cherri Moraga is the co-editor with Gloria Ansaldúa of this bridge called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which is probably one of the most foundational books in feminist theory and Chicano studies. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the Immaculate Heart College in Los Angeles and her master's degree from San Francisco State. Her most recent book is entitled Chicana Codex of Changing Consciousness, Writings 2000-2010, was published by Duke University Press in 2011. Now, just as a personal aside, I happened to be teaching at Duke that year, and I was on the Duke editorial board, and once the wonderful reader reports came in, I was asked by Ken Wissaker, the editor-in-chief, to present Cherri's book to the editorial board, and we were going to vote it up. So it was a real honor to do that, Cherri. And I think you probably got a little version of my report. Again, I'm pretty wise. I didn't make any recommendations for changing anything in that book. In fact, I had learned so much from reading her book. Cherri Moraga's theater and literary contributions have received national recognition, including the National Endowment for the Arts Playwrights Fellowship, 2 Fund for New American Plays Award, the American Studies Association Lifetime Achievement Award, the National Association of Chicano and Chicana Studies Scholar Award, and more. So we have, as I said, we're really treated to having 2 award-winning writers with us in our conversation tonight. In 2007, she won the United States Artist Rockefeller Fellowship for Literature. Her most recent play, New Fire, To Put Things Right Again, received its world premiere at Brava Theater Center of San Francisco in 2012 and is forthcoming in 2013. Since 1997, Cherri has served as an artist in residence in Stanford's Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies, TAPS, sharing an appointment with Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, with an IDA, identity, diversity, and aesthetics focus. I'll just say a little bit about the book, and I won't read from my report. But a Chicana Codex of Changing Consciousness features essays, cuentos, poems by Cherri Moraga, one of the most influential figures in Chicana feminist, queer, and indigenous activism and scholarship. Combining moving personal historias with an acute and elegant political and cultural critique, the writer, activist, teacher, dramatist, mother, daughter, comadre, and lesbian lover looks back over the first 10 years of the 21st century. She considers public events such as 9/11, our wars at home and abroad, the precarity of everyday life, and the campaign and election of Barack Obama. And she explores socioeconomic, cultural, and political phenomena closer to home, sharing her anxieties about raising her son amid increasing urban violence in Oakland and the many forms of dehumanization faced by young men of color. I have 2 young sons, so this is on their reading list to also read. Cherri Moraga describes her deepening grief and melancholia as she loses her mother to Alzheimer's, pays poignant tribute to friends who passed away, including the sculptor Marcia Gomez, and the poets and activist intellectuals, and my former colleague, for example, Alfred Arteaga, Pat Parker, and Audre Lorde, and offers a moving and beautifully well-wrought essay about her personal and political relationship with the Chicana feminist and imaginative writer Gloria Anzaldúa. So as I said, I first, I think, met Cherri in Santa Cruz when I was an assistant professor, and I was writing on Loving in the Warriors, but I also had the great honor of serving on Gloria Anzaldúa's PhD exam in literature. So as I told Gloria after we did a year-long seminar in Chicano literature, that she was teaching me everything I needed to know, and it wasn't a two-way street, unfortunately. Some 30 years after the publication of Anzaldúa and Moraga's collection, This Bridge Called My Back, which is a landmark women of color book, as we all know, Moraga's literary and political praxis remains motivated by and intertwined with indigenous movements and her identity as a Chicana lesbian. Yet aspects of her thinking have changed over time, and that's a great thing. What we may have thought when we were younger changes as we get older and hopefully wiser. And I do think that we have a very wise scholar and writer in our midst. A Chicana Codex of Changing Consciousness weaves a broad tapestry, as she says here. And I like the word tapestry because it is a códice. And what we're getting is not just a traditional Western book, but an Amerindian notion of a writing without words, perhaps. A tapestry, it's tactile, the tactileness of an object, an aesthetic work. The breadth, rigor, and philosophical depth of the book is large. Her views on contemporary debates about our imagined community, about immigration, about gay marriage, and her deepening involvement in a planetary feminist and indigenous activism. It is a major statement by one of our major public intellectuals. And I just wanted to read a little bit because we're both also teachers and we advise similar students that we've had. And I think this is something I love to share with all my students, a statement by Cherríe. She says, "I'm training my students to identify and respect other ways of knowing, to live a life of learning and teaching that do not engage in ever inventive forms of intellectual colonization. I am counting on those few with the rigor to remain conscious to do so, to make strong and clear choices towards free, alternate, subversive thoughts that grows out of a living practice of informed non-cooperation with colonization. I do not have a prescription for what it looks like, what this looks like, but I know that it is daily work, that it requires hard choices, that it means speaking up when we are called to, and deep, deep listening. As a writer with a 30-year-old practice, I have had to learn to listen, to fine-tune my hearing and reading ear for words that proffer living, useful knowledge versus words that convolute meaning, weaken me and promote apathy instead of action." As I said, we have a very wise guest tonight, and it's a real honor to introduce Cherri Moraga.
Hello, I had to take a minute to set this PowerPoint up. Huh? Okay, keep on talking, fill in the...
Wanted to mention
You want the mic? Oh,
in
okay.
addition to all the great works and poems and essays and styles that we have, cuentos, I forgot to mention, which is very important to the book because it is a codice, a tapestry, is a great work that features 9 black and white illustrations by my wonderful former colleague from Berkeley, the wonderful artist Celia de Luis. So I think that's also very much part of the conversation that I want to.
Thank you, Jose. And there is Celia in the flesh. So I'm just going to let those images run. They'll keep kind of running along. There's 9 of them. And when Celia and I do gigs together, we actually get her interpretation of all these, which are a whole story in itself. They are not illustrations. They are a conversation visually with the ideas that are in the book, and this kind of intercambio entre nos. So I wanted them to at least run while I was doing this. I think that Jose, did a pretty thorough introduction, and I'm just really grateful to be here, to get the support from CSRE, and personally also to really thank Jose, because he's actually in some very critical points along the way has come through for me in a good way. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of just a regular way to say it. He came through for me. So I appreciate the support, and this book has a lot to do with that, so thank you. It's also really great to be here with you. And I learned an enormous amount, from your book, from the pages that I read. I think the best way for me to really to do this, and I went kind of back and forth a lot, the book in these 10 years, they were some really hard years. And probably in another 10 years, I would probably say the same. But for me personally, they were very hard years in the context of also such political upheaval. Everything that I write, for the most part, if I'm working in the area of the essay and even the poem, there's always a conversation between the intimate and the institutional. The personal and the political. When I was very young when Bridge came out, when we were starting to work on it, I was 27. And even then, I knew something. And when I say I knew something, I mean we knew something. We knew something as women of color. And that was that theory was in the flesh, that they couldn't be opposed. And ironically, I feel like in the time since then, I'm really grateful for having such a good job for 15 years. And I started when I was 45. And I'm just grateful for being able to, in the way that I can, support myself and my family, and being able to also, because of it being a wealthy institution, what's required of me in terms of my teaching load is much less. So I actually get the opportunity to write. Not enough, but I write. And so I'm very grateful for those things. I also feel that those 15 years of being here has given me a ruthless critique of academia. I feel very much that I have become not less radical, but increasingly criticona. And I think because of that separation of theory and flesh, something that I said many of us knew even in our late 20s, that long ago, and seeing, and I've taught for all those years. I was teaching, even when I didn't have degrees, and I still don't have a PhD, so it's not about that, but even before I had a master's, I was teaching, and the teaching was always out of this this desire to sort of make sense of contradictions. And so I taught in ethnic studies, I taught in women's studies, taught in English departments, I've taught in community-based programs in terms of queer youth of color, Indígena writers. I mean, I've taught for many, many years. And my mandate as a teacher has always been that artists, for one thing, that artists can think, that really and truly that we do know what we're doing, that we do know when we're critiquing, we don't, I am very grateful for people that critique my work because it's a conversation and it also helps give visibility to my work. I learn a lot from critics, but I'm very particular about what I read. And so, meaning that I'm always looking, as a writer, I always look at language. I always try to see if the language opens up something, or if it confuses, if it covers, or if it illuminates. And I think one thing I appreciate about my Manita's writing here is I understood it. And that is an honor. That is not a critique. That's like, thank you. And when I say I didn't have to know anything more than I know, and I've read a lot, but I was able to go through that book and get answers to questions I had because I had not done the research. So I appreciated my sister went and did all that research, and I learned something, thank you very much. To me, that's what it's about, right? But all that is to say is that the book very much then is, has these kinds of conversations. It's, there are, you can see, because I teach, so you'll see, essays around teaching and students and theory keep coming up for me and keep coming up for me. The book is also one thing I really, 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 really want for Chicano literature, is I want us to have the right to ask the profoundest of questions. I want us to be able to consider life and death. I want us to be able to consider genocide. I want us to be able to consider, what happens to memory, cultural amnesia. In 1998, I published a book called Waiting in the Wings, Portrait of a Queer Motherhood. And it came out of, after my son, when he was born, he was very ill. And so I spent a long period of time in the hospital with him, and in terms of him finally getting to a place where he's very well now. But it was a critical time in my life in which, for the first time in my life, I had to confront questions of death in a very visceral way, because when you give birth and then you think you're going to lose it, there's nothing kind of more really traumatic in that. But these 10 years of this book were, as Jose had said, had to do with so many passings, just passing after passing after passing after passing, and my women, Chicanas, and other women of color, and the cost of that. And also the most intimate, which is, of course, the loss of one's mother, and watching her progressively go through Alzheimer's. She taught me an enormous amount. So how much time do I have? Because I want to know what, I always say more than I plan. I have 15 minutes? Okay. Then what I want to do, I actually wanted to read something to you because it says everything to me. Usually if you're looking at a book like this by artists, look at the last thing, not first. Read it in order. They did it for a reason, And I can't imagine people not read it in order. I know lots of people don't read, these visual artists never read in order, just to take that. But read in order, because where it ends and where it begins matters, right? So in this ending, I want to share with you the ending, and because particularly when you're looking at 10 years of time, this is where I left off and where the next book begins. And so I want to offer this to you, and it is about conciencia. It is about consciousness and how one tries to walk in a life awake. And I think try is really the operative term. So this is the epilogue of the book, and it takes about 10 minutes, so I should be good. All right. And also the other thing is that what happens in the intro is I talk about that I write it to be heard. I write on the page, and I'm sure this is also my relationship to theater, is that the language to me is spoken language. So if my mouth can't do it, then it's not working on the page. So partly, this is a body that has written this book. And please know what I'm saying, this, and it's not about me. You know what I'm saying? Like that a writer writes well if he or she is writing with their body, which is always what I'm teaching my students. And I think some of them really get it. Mm-hmm. Chicana mind, beginner mind. When I was a young woman, still living in Los Angeles County, I took a trip north to Monterey Bay, where my boyfriend at the time was stationed at Fort Ord Army Base. It is now the fog-covered campus of a California State University. The year was 1972, and I was not yet 20 years old. Thinking of that time, nearly 4 decades ago, there is the story of a girl who is not me now, but as close to me as compassion can allow. I remember a profound despair, what it was to walk through that sea-salted coastal fog as if heavy gauze were entrapping the heart. I remember speechlessness, talking that had nothing to do with anything that mattered. I imagined such silence as an escape, even as it screamed its disquiet inside of me. I was a Mexican-American girl and a lesbian with no way out of the paradox. During that trip, my boyfriend took leave from the base, and we spent the day in nearby Carmel, in and out of pseudo-counterculture shops and cypress cliffs and English cottage-style houses situated just above the wide plain of a muted slate blue ocean. I remember a gift shop of sorts, the clatter of incessant wind chimes, having to steer ourselves around the many psychedelic colored candles and leafy plants hanging suspended from their macrame holders. Remember macrame, any of you? Was it there that I happened upon the small book, its gray paperback cover of black and white design, the red letters, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind? Was it the title that drew me? Its codex scribe colors, the easy exotic offering of that 3-letter word, Zen. I don't quite know why I was attracted to the book, except to say that I was a child of the times. Since the beat generation of the late 1950s, Eastern thought, as it were, had infiltrated the popular culture of hippies, flower children, and the anti-establishment. As a Mexican-American daughter, I could not fully inhabit any of those categories. Still, there was a nascent longing in me to find life's meaning, an existential quest, I thought, but it was more than this. It was a quest to find meaning for suffering, my own, my mother's, my people's. It was a quest that took me onto a long life of political engagement. Beginner mind. 30 years after first opening the pages of that slim gray volume, I finally make my way to the sitting meditation practice described there. I came to it neither as retreat nor respite, but as resignation to the timeless assurance of death. With my mother in the throes of Alzheimer's as my unwitting Zen teacher, I came to understand that memories are stories we tell ourselves, and then we forget the most thoroughly constructed ones, the ones with the greatest conviction, the ones, and what remains is only the body's knowing. I came to sitting practice as a training ground for locating myself in the simple awareness of the present, the fleeting moment, after all, is all we had to offer one another, my mother and I, and her companion, amnesia. I have put many names to the act of sitting, the sweat lodge, temescal, inipi ceremony, the medicine of the pejuta, the zazen cushion. I sit today as I did intuitively as a child when the Catholic Church rituals of confession and penance threatened to drown me in an ocean of torment. There I would retreat for solace alone in the church pew, sitting straight-backed, open palms on my thighs. I returned to the island of my own earnest heart. There, the punishing pornography of the blaming mind gave way to the silence of an inner, infinitely compassionate God. In silence, not prayer, God talks back. Now middle age, no, that's not what I wrote. Now beyond middle age, I sit in the manner learned from the old ways of this continent, sit up and let what comes come, and always one's pitifulness comes, the confrontation with the mundane thoughts that preoccupy us. But it is truer to say that the thoughts occupy us, as in occupation, as in some exterior force imposing itself upon our natural state. We live in the state of occupation with so many stories to explain away our grief. But I wonder, is it only that we are not our own authors, that we hold others' stories in our minds and try to persuade our hearts that a conquest that occurred more than 500 years ago is no longer remembered in our DNA? I wonder if we were to grow quiet enough, might we recollect what has been scattered and desecrated by history? Might we remember ourselves? Might we reconcile a suffering that cannot be rendered in language? Sitting as in ceremonies about discomfort, the body allowing us this awareness without trying to fix it right away, but getting to know oneself inside discomfort and even pain, yes, pain on the red road to wellness. And so during the medicine ceremony, when we heave up the poisons of our prisons from a gut racked with grief, it is referred to as getting well. When we sit in meditation, it is as one does with the medicine, this pain a precursor to the illness that awaits us, this illness a precursor to death unless we are taken by surprise. I sit because we are taken by surprise daily, moment by moment. The Earth's upheaval in Haiti, followed by Chile's devastation, provides irrefutable testimony to this. We imagine we have control when we don't, and we suffer in the effort to have some elusive, deluded sense of control when our beloveds become old and die anyway or are blasted down by execution fire, not hyperbole, or are bludgeoned to death by their only son. The surprise deaths of Ingrid Washinawatak and Marcia Gomez within a year of each other at the close of the 20th century changed my life forever. Their deaths were what I knew and feared as a child, that prayers do not ward off death. Prayers simply bear witness, and death happens. The United States as a collective body confronted its lack of control when those twin towers crumbled like toast at the dawn of this century. Even as a nation state, we could not keep death at abeyance. Ashamedly, we send our children to do that futile job for us. Call it by many names, but probably the war on terror is the most apt, as terror is nothing more than organized fear, our own as a country. We fight terror like we are fighting windmills. More than a generation ago, I landed upon a small and first book that spoke of the practice of sitting meditation. The profoundly simple meaning of the book, which lay occulted in the white space surrounding the black glyphs of letters on its pages, surely escaped me as a 20-year-old. Now, returning to the book a lifetime later, its deepest meanings may escape me still. However, what I do retain of the essence of the Slim's book's meaning, even from my first partial read of it, is this: that if we are filled up, that if we believe that we already know, we will learn nothing, because there is no empty space, no not knowing space in which to learn, in which to change. Has my education, then, been nothing more than this process of unlearning? Acquiring knowledges ancient and prophetic that do not cling to us, that do not become armor in the battle against ignorance, but pass through the body, altering cells of memory with the lightness, clarity, and effervescence of meaning. Chicana mine, speaking for the ancestors. Recently, my 16-year-old son began to take on the body of a man. I cannot say that our years together have gone quickly. I can say that looking back, Whole years take only a moment to remember. They accumulate in this way, in the way in which we say, my, how time flies. But it does not fly, it labors. There are moments of flight, yes, when we glimpse change already complete, when we forget to knock and catch the naked length of our teenage daughter with a woman's full pubis. She's still with a girl's mind, still a whirlwind of fantasia and delight. The disconnect unsettles, a fragile equilibrium disturbed, as it is so in the changing countenance of my son. Time does not fly. It labors to understand what just got left behind. Yesterday I was happy. Yesterday I played a board game with my boy after making him some quesadillas for dinner, and the bright sun set with an encroaching chill through the bay view of our window. Neither of us wished we were somewhere else. That is so much to say. Knowing that on the other side is death, on the other side of the ocean, the other side of the city block, the other side of the kitchen table, we were happy, as we will be and have been sad. As sad and happy slip away, as childhood slips into the old age of my son that I will never witness. Still, we remember and mark the time. I remember. It was a few months after my mother's passing. I come into the house after walking the dog. I wash my hands, remove my jacket, and go straight away to finishing a few leftover dishes in the sink. Rafael comes in. I feel him at my back, standing some distance from me in the doorway. I don't remember if he says anything to me. It feels like he just came into the kitchen to know, to acknowledge I had returned. And I stand at the sink in the full weight of motherhood. I am somebody's only mother, as my mother was to me. And at that moment, I know the space that my body occupies, that physicality, is what most matters. That I am not gone, that I have returned, that I will most likely return again after long walks with the dog in the rain. And this is what I miss most about my own mother, that she will not return to me embodied in this way. I conclude this book as my boy assumes the body of a man. On this day, I sit at my altar and I ask for the courage to release him. These are the words that come to me, simple, direct. Help me let him go. And I whisper them aloud so that my body hears the sound of the same exact language I had used throughout my mother's dying years and those first hardest months of mourning. It feels the same. I know this viscerally, a DNA knowing. If my mother's last years in the awe of Alzheimer's taught me anything, it was a necessity to love without holding on. It is a lesson that the body refuses, that requires soul to enact, that must be practiced daily and relearned in ruthless confrontation with those most pivotal moments of change in our lives. Today, as I witness the final waning of my son's boyhood, I remember how in the first month of his life, as his 2 pounds of skin and bone and organ lay upon under the surgeon's blade, I prayed in the effort to release him, should he or the universe decide this. It countered every instinct in me and drew from a place of soul to believe that there are greater rhymes and reasons for our existences, short and long, than mere survival. Linda Hogan writes, "We Indian people who had inhabited the land had not been meant to survive, and yet we did, some of us, carrying the souls of our ancestors, and now they speak through us. It was this that saved my life. This is what the elders teach. This is what I have learned in ceremony, what I have looked at in the white space of meditation that is the mirror of death. That our actions in this life can heal our ancestors on the other side, that this corporal knowing does not hold us, that we can remember histories and futures through and in spite of the body we wear, and my relatives are with me before and after my coming, and the son I raise is my blood ancestor returned, and my beloved is someone I knew like this before." These are not knowings, not imaginings, not stories we tell ourselves to bring comfort to the grieving, because they do not comfort. They provide energy for hard change and transformation. In them resides the meaning of the loss, from my mother's demented and illuminated passing to the horror of Haiti's quaking devastation, that we might become well again. She and I, Haiti, and all my relations. Postscript. In this relative reality called my identity, I carve out a new way of seeing that holds nothing in the face of death. This is all I can offer of what I know of conciencia, that it occurs from a mind outside of conviction, that true consciousness responds to the intuitive, the less than visible, the hidden impulse, the viscerality of the discontent. Thank you. Is it time? Thank you.